Welcome to Sons of Patriarchy. Before we dive into today's episode, we want to take a moment to provide a content warning. In this episode, we'll be discussing sensitive topics, including emotional, spiritual, and sexual abuse. We understand that these subjects can be triggering for many listeners. If you find yourself feeling uncomfortable or need to take a break, please feel free to pause or skip to a later segment. Your well-being is our top priority. We encourage you to reach out for support if you need it. There are resources available to help you through difficult times, and those can be found in our show notes and intake forms to private support communities, which are screened. Thank you for being here with us today. Welcome to Silenced No More, Abuse in the OPC, Part 5. In this episode, you will meet Rachel Curtis, former member at Cities Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Cait West, author of Rift, and you can find that in our show notes, and a former member of the OPC and PCA. She shows up again in episode 13, It's Only a Matter of Rank. Rachel's husband, along with Joe Rigney and the pastors at Cities Church, attempted to tell her what she needed to work on and worry less about her husband. She, and not her husband, was eventually excommunicated on January 15th, 2023, 2 years and 1 day from the date that this episode publishes. Cait West grew up in the stay-at-home daughter movement, alive and well at the OPC where she grew up in Colorado. Cait's life was ruled by her father, Patriarchy, was shamed for her body, and was told to never trust her feelings. In these circles, your life as a woman is figured out for you. You just happen to live it. Let's begin with Rachel Curtis.
My name's Rachel Curtis. Yeah, so I got married in May of 2015, and I moved to Minnesota because my ex-husband was going to Bethlehem College and Seminary, which is where Joe Rigney was a professor. And we started attending Cities Church, which is a Bethlehem church plant. And Joe was one of the pastors there. So I met him pretty early on, just was really aware of who he was, given his connection with my ex-husband's school and then our church. And so, that's how I knew Joe. And then I don't remember exactly when, but I know through time, it was a big deal, his connection with Doug Wilson. And he came from his college and things like that. And so, definitely had heard of Doug Wilson. Lots of people at Bethlehem were kind of fans of him at the school because of Joe and his influence and the books and things like that.
Gotcha. So, with Cities Church, so this is you said Minnesota, right? So this is a plant of Bethlehem College and Seminary. And people might know Bethlehem College and Bethlehem Baptist from John Piper. So he's a big name in Reformed evangelicalism. So Joe Rigney, kind of his right-hand man, and in a sense, was also big too. But for Cities Church, what was the culture like at Cities Church, both theologically, socially, culturally, whatever it may be, and then also maybe compared to your church growing up, or if you were church growing up, what was that like being at Rigney's church with your husband? What was that culture like?
Yeah, so at the time, I thought at the time that it was a pretty good church, and there was a lot of people our age, and so it seemed like we could connect with a lot of people, given that I had just moved to a new state. But there were definitely times throughout our time there that I really felt like there was a disconnect between how people, what the pastors and the leadership said to how people behaved. And at the time, there were things that didn't personally bother me, but in hindsight, I see the culture where it's very much about men are really elevated above women in like an unhealthy level. And women were not allowed to do things like, they weren't allowed to come and give announcements on Sunday or pray on Sunday or anything like that. And so it was a very They said outwardly, we love women, they're amazing, but how that played out was very opposite of that, and how they treated women. And I came to find that kind of even later in going through what I went through at the church, so you're pretty much good to go if you do what they say and kind of go along with the culture. And so I would say pretty toxic. There's a lot of people, even in my community group and my life group, that ended up, flipping on me, siding with pastors, that kind of thing. So it's very much the pastor's way or the highway. So,
yeah. So when did your time? So how long were you there before things started cropping up? Because it didn't start off bad. It sounds great. I mean, a lot of these churches sound great on the front end. Community and friends and fellowship and preaching and all that stuff sounds great on the front end. So it's usually these churches aren't like big warning signs saying, "Don't come here, we're a cult." But that's not how it usually starts. So when did your time at Cities Church and your relationship with Joe Rigney, your husband, and other pastors, when did that become or start becoming spiritually abusive?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had been going to Cities Church for about 6 years, through my whole marriage. But I would say it was after 4 years. So in 2019 was when I met with Joe Rigney, and I had been dealing with my ex-husband being addicted to pornography and lying, and it just was not something that there was help and support for, and I thought that it was getting better, but it wasn't. And so we ended up meeting with Joe, and he became the point pastor involved in our marriage. And, for 3 years, I worked with Joe. I reached out to him via email, text, at church. I would go up to him at church. I would talk with him. And at first he gave, some solid advice. He didn't check in with us regularly over those 3 years until things got really bad in the marriage. I was the one that reached out to him consistently, for help. And so I remember early on in meeting with Joe that he asked me, why I would confront my husband on his sin when I suspected he was lying. And he said it was not my job to police my husband. I needed to work on trusting God to bring things to the light. But there had been a habitual pattern of lying, so I could sense when something was off, and then I would try to fact check it or verify it. So at that time, I took his advice and kept doing what he said I should do. And this went on for about 2 years. So I remember in 2021 of May, I called Joe in tears saying I couldn't keep suffering like this in my marriage, because it had been over 7 years of lying and pornography, and nothing seemed to be getting better. Despite all my efforts, I had worked really hard to trying to fix things in my marriage, do the work, try to get my husband help, that kind of thing. So I remember that was kind of a big catalyst for like my marriage. And, it seemed fine, talking with Joe, plugging along, kind of his advice, like I said, sometimes was solid. And then looking back, it really was, it didn't help or change anything. And then Joe said that at that time, when I called him in May of 2021, he said he would deal with my husband and his sin. And he told me that I needed to let the pastors handle it, and that he was not like the other pastors I had known, because I had known other abusive pastors who betrayed my trust. And he really was like, we got your back. Like, we're going to deal with your husband. You can trust us. He was fully confident. And because I had built a relationship with him, for a couple of years, I was like, okay, in tears, I'm like, okay, I trust you, you got this. So then that was kind of the beginning of the end, as it were, because in July of 2021, my ex-husband got fired from his job for use of pornography at work. He did not ever speak to me about this. I found out through a mutual friend who was in his life group. He notified me. And at this time, it was, we had just separated for the last time in July of 2021. So there was just a lot of financial fallout I have two girls, and there was a lot of financial fallout for us with that. And, just lack of responsibility, because even when my ex-husband got a new job, he allowed our health insurance to terminate. He wasn't taking the steps to provide our most basic needs at that time. So then, while Joe and another pastor, Ryan Griffith, who's kind of another big name in Reformed and at Bethlehem College, Bethlehem Church, but Cities Church, that kind of thing. So I would kind of talk with Joe. Ryan Griffith would talk with my ex-husband. So they worked closely with our case. And for me, it became evident that they were not handling the situation the way they should. Because of that, because I felt like there was some disagreements in how things were being handled and what they were telling me I needed to do. It kind of reached a point where I was seeing that I needed to leave the church and get help elsewhere. And I would say that I didn't think that their pastoral care to me was aligning with what I believed were biblical principles. They continued to listen to my ex-husband's lies, even though I had exposed some of those lies to them. They would still just take what he said at face value and encourage me to give the benefit of the doubt when there'd been a pattern of lying. And so a few important factors about this is just that, number one, Joe told me he did not know what to do about my husband and his sin, that they hadn't seen a case with pornography to this level. But he pressured me into ending the separation. And instead of truly supporting me, he pushed for us to reconcile quickly without me seeing the fruit of repentance and change in my ex-husband. He was it was very evident that his main goal was, how can we get you guys back together without the work of repentance. Yeah. Number two, Joe and the pastors told me that I cannot know if my husband is repentant because I don't live with him. But they didn't live with him either.
That's true. That's a good point.
So I found that ironic that I was told I can't know or judge or gauge where he's at, but they can, but they don't live with him. And Joe also said I should not spend my time watching for his repentance, but working on what God had for me in that season. But I don't know how I could reconcile without looking for repentance and seeing that he was repentant. And then I wanted to quote a text message that I got from Joe, because at the time it really did not set well with me. And I felt like that was, again, another sign that we are not aligning in how this sin should be handled and how this should be cared for. So I had just texted Joe because my ex-husband I had caught him in another lie. Very minimal. It was kind of a weird lie that it just was like, I didn't understand why he lied. But anyway, so this is the text from Joe, and he says, okay, this is a good opportunity. You can see his, meaning my ex-husband's, passions at work here. He is lying out of self-protection, afraid of your response. You want him to grow in his fear of God and God's response. When he sins and is tempted to lie or minimize so as not to upset you, you want him to be more oriented to God and what God requires of him. More fear of God equals less fear of Rachel equals less lying and minimizing. That gives you something to both pray toward and something to encourage him toward. It is also something that both of you can grow in together. You also need to fear God, not your husband or his sin.
and you can encourage him to lead in this without doing it for him. Husband, I need you to help me not fear anything that is frightening because I am tempted to fear in this, by you yourself not fearing anything that is frightening, like my reaction disappointing me, etc. So that was the text Joe sent me, and I remember pushing back on Joe sin leveling, equalizing my struggles and sin to his, because I said, I don't lie about my sin. I said that to Joe. I said it like, but the difference here is that I'm not the one lying about my sin. And this kind of advice I realize now was really unhealthy. It feeds into the narrative that women need to pander their husbands even in their sin. But let's encourage you by kind of fawning over you and being like, I need help too, and I sin too, and let's, this is something we can both work on. And it's like, no, I wasn't the one lying. So, so there was a lot of things for sure leading up to realizing, but these I just were some highlights of, okay, I'm disagreeing, I'm pushing back, and I see the writing on the wall here, like they are not going to budge. And like at one point Joe said, well, we think you should do this and you can disagree with us, but we can't really help you move forward if you don't do what we say. So I was like, okay, well, it was just kind of a crossroads. And I had started to attend like a support group at another church, and they were more equipped to handle this kind of thing. And so I was like, okay, I think I need to go somewhere where there's accountability and there's actual help and trained people to deal with this kind of issue. So I reached out to Joe about leaving cities, and he wanted to talk with me on the phone. So we talked for 2 hours, and when I explained my situation and why I was wanting to leave and where things were at with my ex-husband, he defended my ex-husband in that conversation. When I tried to say he's still lying, he defended him and made excuses for his lies. He accused me of projecting my distrust of my husband onto the pastors. He thought that was why I was leaving, was that I was just projecting, and that I needed to meet with multiple pastors to help me get over my distrust. He said that I needed to not run away from hard things, that leaving the church was my way of running away from hard things, and that I shouldn't seek people to coddle me, and that leaving could be a way that I'm seeking a free pass to sin because of the suffering in my marriage, which I never understood because I was never committing any sin. That was very confusing, but it was a huge shift. Like for 3 years, Joe and I had been having conversations. I went to him, texted him, went to him crying at church, overwhelmed with my marriage, seeking his stability, seeking his advice. And this conversation, his tone was totally different. Like he treated me so different than he had been speaking to me, and he really spoke to me in a way where we could go back and forth and things like that. And this felt like that catalyst of, again, you disagree with them and they come down on you. And so I just remember bawling on the phone, and that had never happened. I was always able to have like a conversation with him. And I was only trying to explain why I felt like I needed to leave, but he came down on me in such a controlling way. And his harsh tone, his false accusations. I mean, he had said some affirming things about me. He was really encouraging, and now he was just accusing me of all sorts of things that were not true. And his harshness, we could hash out our differences, but this time it was like laying down the hammer. He's verbally coming down on me as if I was far beneath him, as if I was a child, that he was just, I needed to obey him. And it was very spiritually abusive. the way I reacted. Like if someone is a true godly shepherd and we're having a conversation as adults and I'm sharing what I think I need, there was no gentleness and humility in that. It was like attack towards me. And so that was, that really rocked me. That was really traumatic for me. And I felt very, very, what's the word, like harmed by that, where I could not then, I didn't even have the capacity to like explain, to some of my friends that what had happened and why I was leaving. Because again, even in that conversation, just berating me. And so a while later, a few months later, he emailed me. And at this point, I was still separated from my ex-husband. He went to that church. I was going to a different church. Like I said, he really defended him in his lies. And so here's an email that I received from Joe on January 12th of 2022. Hey, Rachel, I hope you're doing well. I continue to pray for you and your husband and God's work in your life. I wanted to check in with you about a couple of things. First, I can't remember if you had communicated to any of the pastors about plans to formally transition from City's Church. I think you had mentioned at one point, so I wanted to follow up. If you still desire to do so, simply let me or Pastor Jonathan know when you begin the process of joining a like-minded church so we can formalize the transfer of membership. Until then, we'll keep you on our membership roster. We'll continue to pray for you as a member and to check in to see where things stand. The second item has to do with your husband. The pastors are encouraged by the evidence we have seen of his progress in successfully fighting sin and living in purity. In particularly, we've seen evidence of him addressing patterns of self-pity and passivity and are encouraged by the development of discipline, personal responsibility, and diligence. His therapist has affirmed the positive changes in him as well as addressing making concrete attempts toward healing and reconciliation in his marriage. As a result of this progress, we intend to encourage him to serve again as part of the worship team should he desire to do so. However, before we extend this opportunity to him, we wanted to hear from you if there are evidences contrary to what we have seen or reasons that we are not aware of by which he should be restricted from serving in this or other ways at Cities. Let me know if you have particular reservations or if you share in our sense of encouragement. I look forward to hearing from you. Clinging to Jesus with you, Joe Rigney. So I received that email from Joe on January 12th of 2022. And February 10th of 2022, I had confronted my ex-husband, telling him that I knew he was still living in sin and that he wasn't being honest. And I got an email from my ex-husband admitting to using pornography, acting in sexual sin, drinking, and lying. So this was a little over a month after Joe wanted to restore him to the worship team. And I never heard from Joe again. He never reached out that I'm aware. I never received any sort of follow-up after him wanting to restore him to the worship team and then finding out that I was in fact correct, that this lifestyle of sin was still going on. So I never heard from Joe after that. And on January 15th, 2023, so 2 years ago, Jonathan Parnell, the lead pastor at Cities Church, and Joe Rigney, as well as my ex-husband, had me publicly excommunicated from Cities Church. They explicitly said that I have sought divorce, which they believe I did not have biblical grounds to do so, and that due to my unwillingness to continue speaking with them, I have a hardened heart. They said that they are affirming that I am not in Christ. They said that in order to be restored, I would need to talk to them. they claim my ex was repentant, and the examples they gave were his counseling, his sex addicts group, and that he had not sinned in the past year, which isn't true because we just read the email from February. So this was, they said for a year he had been sober. Joe also says that looking at a woman with lust is adultery of the heart, which is different from actual adultery. So I'm going to play this clip from the excommunication recording where you can hear Joe speaking this theology.
Part of what happens here is I was one of the pastors involved in pastoral care along with Brian Murphy going back years. Okay, so there's been some recurring things in there, and two things became evident in the last year and a half. One was the kind of difference of exegetical things. So there is something, I think, for Rachel in that flattening out, so to look at a woman lustfully is to commit adultery. Jesus says to look at a woman lustfully is to commit adultery in your heart. And so the question is whether or not the theological question is adultery in the heart different than adultery in fact? Okay? And so there's that piece. But the other thing that really did become evident in this was just kind of like an absolute cutting off and a removal of herself from any engagement with the pastors, and not just with the pastors, but with community group leaders and other people in her life. And so there was at one point, there have been lots of conversations and shepherding through the difficulties of the marriage.
So Joe also says that there was a huge shift in me listening to the pastors to then cutting them off and being done with my marriage, which was the furthest thing from the truth. So here's the clip of Joe publicly accusing me of that.
And I would say for a good period of the marital difficulties, that was true for both ups and downs, highs and lows, like you got heavy and intense. And then at some point, it really did shift substantially. And I mean, when I'm talking in the sense of pastoral care, conversations, text threads, meeting with community group leaders, all of those sort of things. And then all of a sudden, it's like, I'm just done with that entirely. Not just done with the marriage, but done with kind of you, all of you. So that really did shift it from not really okay, if you're not, to use John as there, I want to forgive, but I'm hurt really bad and I need some time. It's like, that's great, that's understandable. It shifted from that to something much more deep and hardened to I'm not even willing to try. I'm over.
So Jonathan Parnell, the lead pastor, also said that he had a hunch that I wanted to leave City's Church because I wanted to get divorced, and I knew they would disagree. This is the furthest thing from the truth. That was never the issue for me. I was leaving because of how the pastors were treating me in my situation and their lack of holding accountable for my ex's sin. I never wanted to get divorced. That was not my heart in leaving the church at all. And he also said that, Jonathan said, he thinks that I think that they are crazy in this public excommunication that I have the recording of. He said, I think she thinks we're crazy. I never said this. In fact, I was very respectful of Joe, and I never said anything like this to anybody. I respectfully left. I was asking to have support of a new church and support, because they had support groups for this type of sin. I asked my ex-husband to not continue at City's Church because of starting to see the toxic ways and having 2 daughters. I didn't want my girls being raised and treated this way in a church that's very patriarchal. I did not even pursue divorce because of adultery of the heart. I pursued divorce because my ex-husband was in unrepentant sin, particularly dishonesty. And I told him that. We had a counseling session after I filed for divorce. And I said, the breakdown in the marriage was, he thought it was his pornography. And I told him, which I had told him for 6 years, that I would stick with him through his struggle everyone has sin, everyone has addictions, everyone has issues. I told him, our whole marriage, I'm always going to stick with you through this sin struggle, but that if it ever became a way of life that he was okay with, I would not be a part of that. And I told that to the pastors as well. So the issue was that he did not stop lying. And for me, that was where I was like, there's no building trust if there's dishonesty. We can't move forward if there's lying. So with that, here's the email that I sent to Joe after our 2-hour conversation, where he really berated me. And this is what I said, which again shows that they were accusing me of just being done with them, done with my marriage, which wasn't true. So on October 28th, 2021, I said, hey, Pastor Joe. So like I said I would after our conversation last Sunday, I have been prayerfully reconsidering my decision to leave City's church. He asked me to prayerfully reconsider, and I did. After seeking the Lord on it and really considering what you said, I still believe the Lord is leading me to leave. I prayed about it and earnestly sought him, and he has given me peace about this decision. It truly is not a decision I am making in fear, nor am I running away from pressing into hard things at Cities. I am not seeking to be coddled, nor am I seeking to sin and get a free pass for sinning because of the suffering in my marriage. I am also not leaving mad at you or thinking you are a bad person. My heart is truly seeking what God has for me in this season. I don't feel it necessary or helpful to continue conversations and ask you respect my decision in leaving, as I have seriously considered what you've said and truly valued your input. I have so appreciated you and the conversations we have had in the past 3 years. I am sad to leave, but I need to do what I think the Lord is calling me to. Blessings and thank you, Rachel. So while he said he disagreed, he said I could leave the church. After I responded, he said Jonathan Parnell, the lead pastor, said it was unprecedented to have one marriage person in one church and one in another, one spouse, and they wanted me to retain my membership at Cities. So that was, again, to me, a very awful thing that, Joe and I had a really respectful conversation that I listened, I responded, and then they, just because they flipped their mind on me leaving, didn't mean I had, they were trying to force me to have conversations. And because I didn't, they thought I had a hard heart, when you can see by my email that was not my heart, and that I communicated that to Joe. And then there's just a big thing that I want to share, because 3 weeks before my excommunication, where they, Jonathan Parnell publicly claims that my ex is repentant and that they have seen this over a year. 3 weeks before the excommunication, we owned a rental property, and we had a tenant who was a believer that wrote this email to my ex-husband, December 26, 2022. Just wanted to give you some feedback as you sell the house and we transition out. We have lived in many places, even internationally, in a third world country. Our experience here has been the worst of any of the places we have lived. The lawn hardly got mowed all summer. The snow didn't get moved, both of which were supposed to be included in our rent. We volunteered to mow the grass, but were told there was no money to be able to pay us to do it. We have been shoveling the snow, and I have sent a Venmo money request for payment, but it has not been taken care of. The dishwasher has not been working well for the last several months, which was never taken care of, as well, which you were made aware of. These are just to name a few things. Communication is another subject. It was and currently still is non-existent. If it wasn't for Rachel trying to help us through the sale, we wouldn't know anything about what was going on. As well, you still owe us a security deposit. I am giving you notice that if I do not see it, I will be talking to a lawyer and considering my options based on what he says. I would strongly encourage you to think carefully about decisions that you make in the future and consider if you are willing and able to take on the responsibility of the decision. As a Christian and as a man, you need to stand up, take responsibility for your actions, no matter if they work out good or bad. It is a man's job to face things and deal with them, even when it is not easy or doesn't turn out as planned. I realize you've had a lot to deal with in your own family over the last year or so, but that still does not release you from responsibilities in other areas of your life. I have been very easygoing and patient with everything regarding the house because of what you have been dealing with in your own life, but I am now wondering if that caused more harm than good because nothing was taken care of remotely the way it should have been. You have 2 girls that are watching you and that you are responsible for. None of the thoughts that I am writing here will do you any good if you develop any attitudes other than one that will prompt you to stand up, take responsibility for your actions, and learn from your mistakes. Now go forward considering all of this. So that was an email that the tenant wrote to my ex-husband 3 weeks before they excommunicated me. Again, you can remember from earlier email where Joe said we've seen progress in all of these areas that this tenant says clearly was not the case for the year. So yeah, my ex-husband's actions were not matching his words. And then the pastors falsely accused me of being in sin. So I was not in any habitual sin. My heart was not hard. I was not unforgiving. In fact, I reached out to my ex-husband even through the divorce process in hopes of reconciling, to which he was still unchanged in his hardness of heart, which is what they accused me of.
I have a question that's not on the list that I sent you, but it just pops up for me, and I'd assume listeners are thinking the same thing. Why do you think, or is it just like patriarchy is the reason? But why do you think Joe and all the other pastors at City's Church so desperately desired to back up your husband when it was pretty clear that it's your husband's fault and not yours?
Yeah, that's a great question. The 2 things that I've thought about as reasons for that was, one, it makes them look good to restore him to the worship team. It makes the church look good, and it also, there was another. This is a side note. There was another pastor at the time who came to my house and spoke with me, who'd only met with my ex-husband a couple of times, and said, he's all good in the brotherhood. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. Like, so I think it's a male patriarchy thing. And then I think it's what makes them look good. But I think the biggest thing for the excommunication piece was a public statement to say, if you go against what we say, here's what's going to happen to you. We're going to punish you. Like, I think it was to make a statement to everybody, especially women. Here's the issue. Here's what's going on. There was no biblical grounds to excommunicate me. You can disagree on divorce. You can't excommunicate me because of it. I'm not living in any habitual sin. God's word nowhere says, you're in sin because you changed churches and didn't keep talking to your pastors who spiritually abused you. That's not a sin. And so, they did that to me. And I think it was really to make an example of their way or the highway.
Mm-hmm. Now, before the last 2-parter question, in our pre-recording call, you had said that now that this had happened to you, it made sense, things that were happening before that you couldn't quite put a finger on. Like, why are these people leaving? What are they saying? Can you talk about that too, for those whom have not been excommunicated yet from their churches for doing the things that you've done or not done, but noticing, oh shoot, maybe this is why these people left, and the church told us one thing when it's actually another thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they just present a really good facade up front. They make it look like that they're really, oh, this person left, but it was almost like we let them leave because they worked so hard at our church and we just wanted to, thank them for what they did. Like it just made me think back on different things that were presented publicly that I don't think were true behind the scenes. And I think too, kind of what we had talked about in the pre-recording as well was, I had an epiphany moment when I started reading some of Doug Wilson's sayings.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe, coming from his school and now back with Doug, clearly was influenced by him. And my ex was also influenced by him as well as Ryan Griffith. And so like all of these men were Doug Wilson fans, followers, affirmers. It was like the missing piece to the puzzle for me as to why they were treating me this way. I remember saying, oh my gosh, this all makes sense now. If this is Doug's theology, no wonder why Joe and Ryan and my ex are treating me this way. They are getting their beliefs about men and women from Doug Wilson. They think women need to obey the man, come back under their rule and authority at all costs, regardless of any sins committed. And it's like they knew my ex was still lying. I told them this on multiple occasions, and they wanted to make an example out of me to the church. If a woman steps out from their counsel, this is what will happen. And it was literally that light bulb moment, that missing piece to the puzzle of like, oh, this is why, because this is Doug Wilson's theology. And they all were fans and reading his books and kind of coming under that philosophy that permeates out, like that permeated out into how I was being treated so horribly for sins I did not commit. I didn't do anything wrong. And so it really that really clicked for me of like, oh.
I was going to correct you. Actually, you did commit one sin. The sin was questioning them as a woman.
Yeah. I disagreed, so I had to get kicked out. But and I think that I did just want to speak to the impact, I think.
Yeah, go for it.
Just walking this road was one of the most painful roads to walk. The loss of my marriage, the loss of my hopes and dreams, the brokenness of my trust in someone I loved. I loved my husband. And that being compounded with the church's response to publicly humiliate me by falsely slandering me and accusing me of not being in Christ, because that's the one thing I care the most about is my relationship with Jesus. And to have people who claim to love me and care about me and to have my back not only betray me, but stab me in the back, that was horrifying and traumatic for me and my children. I mean, my two girls watched a lot of this happen. And to watch my two little girls suffer instead of being shepherded was so traumatic, for all of us. And for me to imagine as a mother, my children going to a church where not only have I been publicly declared an unbeliever, but that their own father would let me take the blame for his sin. I think the darkness that I suffered, the harm that I walked through, I think of, David when he says in Psalm 55, if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God as we walked about among the worshipers. And I just think that not only was it a betrayal of my marriage, it was a betrayal of my church, which is why I tried to leave respectfully, because I could see the errors of their ways
coddling my ex-husband, giving him a free pass, and coming down on me, the woman. It just was really, really just a double trauma. I think if it had been, we see the toxicity in the church, and as a married couple, we're going to go find a new church and get the help we need. We could have weathered that storm, or vice versa. Like if the church had supported me with my marriage and I had the help that I needed, I could have weathered that storm. But to have both was really hard. And I think that the Psalm 55, it says, "As for me, I call to the Lord, I call to God, and the Lord saves me. Evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress, and he hears my voice." And that speaks to me, and that Jesus was really with me in the darkness. He was close to me in the suffering and the betrayal. And at the end of the day, I knew that I answered to God and not evil men. And that's why I stayed strong to do what I did and to leave, because I knew that I ultimately answered to God, not to Joe Rigney, not to Jonathan Parnell, not to my ex-husband, but what would be honoring to God. And my home having habitual sin was not honoring God. And I had to take that stand, even though it cost me almost everything. And my heart was to honor the Lord. And, I suffered a lot. I couldn't go to church for, a while. I mean, it was just really traumatic, really triggering, really, even the shame too, that I felt like I'm this single mom with 2 little girls, and is everybody staring at me and judging me at church? And like, even if they weren't, there was just so many layers of having to undo this theology, this toxicity that I had been in for so long that I didn't realize, was as bad as it was.
Yeah. So can you end by talking to 2 groups? The first one being those listening, and maybe like Rachel, 6 or 7 years ago, or even sooner than that, who may not have caught everything on the front end, but pieces are starting to come together, but they're still in one of these churches. And then number 2, can you talk to Joe Rigney and the pastors of Cities Church, because they can't speak back to you. You're the one who's telling them. Now that you see what they did for what it is, spiritual abuse. So talk to those 2 groups.
Yeah. I think I would say I would want to tell others, men and women, that are in these churches or at Cities even, that or influenced by Doug Wilson. I think his tentacles of influence in books and theology are far-reaching. That the best thing they can do to get out from the toxicity is to seek outside help and support from people who are not in it. I think to seek counsel from outside voices, from those who are educated and understand God's heart for the oppressed, in order to give them the strength to leave and find healing from what they're under. It's so hard to weather the storms of spiritual abuse and toxicity when we're in it, because we don't often see it. I look back and go, I didn't realize what I was in, And I think having outside voices, that's what helped me to see it for what it was and to stay strong when the abuse amped up. I think that having someone else who can be a neutral party to point out, like, they said what? Like, they're doing what? You don't see it when you're just steeped in it. And that's all the people you're around is, your friends and your pastors and everybody's in that. It really does become very much, like you said at the beginning, like a cult, where you're steeped in it and you judge others for leaving, you judge others for disagreeing, you think the pastors are right. So I think having outside voices is what helped me. And I'd like to encourage others in toxic marriages as well and to just say that to them to get outside help if their church is not holding those who are in habitual sin accountable. Like, don't stay in that. Like, go get help to get healthy. Don't just do what the pastors are saying when you see clearly for what it is. So I switching to your second question, I would like to say to Joe Rigney that you need to publicly recant what you did to me. You need to repent and make right this horrific act that you did in the name of Jesus. It was egregiously sinful and evil. It was wrong. And I would want to tell you that you are exactly like the pastors you claimed you weren't. I trusted you, I respected you, and you used your pastoral role for evil. I hope you will see the error of your ways and come out of the abusive culture you are perpetuating with Doug Wilson. I'd like to speak to Jonathan Parnell, and I'd like to say that you are not above accountability. You try to leverage your spiritual authority to convince people to go along with your ways, and they are not God's ways. You have acted evil, and you have loved what makes you look good over what is right. You have elevated men above women to an abusive measure, and you publicly spiritually abused me to make an example to other women that if they don't obey you, they too will be punished. This is not God's way. I would also like to speak to my ex-husband and say that what you have done to horrifically abuse me and your children, as no repentant man would have allowed anyone to take the fall for his sin and be publicly slandered, has caused us damage beyond words. Despite this, I hope for the sake of your children and for the sake of your own soul that you would turn from your hypocrisy and humble yourself before God. Proverbs 6:16-19 reads, "There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community." I would also like to say to everyone involved, and there are people and friends that still go there, ex-friends that were in my community group and life group that have not gotten out, that sided with the pastors and betrayed me. And I just would like to ask that they ask themselves, what is fundamentally wrong with your own heart that you would be okay abusing someone like this? What grievous sins are you harboring that you would act so unjustly to one of God's children?
Now, on to Cait West, author of the book Rift, about her life in the stay-at-home daughter movement at an OPC in Colorado and how she got out. Let's get to know her.
My name is Cait West. I'm the author of a book called Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. I currently live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and work as an editor. But a lot of my work outside of that is advocating for survivors of spiritual abuse. And I see my book as part of that work.
We at Sons of Patriarchy have been told time and time again just how little influence Doug Wilson has on the OPC and the PCA, not to mention all of NAPARC. But it's not only Doug's influence we're worried about, though that's our focus. He's but one influence among many. He's just the most media savvy of the bunch. So here's how Cait got to know Doug himself.
It's so interesting. The name Doug Wilson, I don't remember a time when I didn't know his name because he was such an impending figure, an imposing figure in my life and in my family, how we lived. I grew up as a kid in Pennsylvania, and we went to a PCA church in Maryland. And Doug Wilson was a big influence in that church, and he would come out for conferences. I have this vague memory of picking him up at the airport one time, and my dad would go out to Moscow for conferences out there. And our church in Maryland created a classical Christian school based on Doug Wilson's, the model of schools that he has promoted the past few decades. And my two older siblings went to that church school, that classical school. So he was a big influence, especially in my early childhood. And we had all of his books, all of his tapes. I listened to him all the time. His voice is so familiar. It's almost as familiar as my own father's, which is distressing, actually, because when I hear him now, it can be very triggering because it reminds me of the things that he says and how harmful it is against women.
What was life like for Cait in these circles? That's what I asked her next.
So I thought God was just like my father, except bigger. And my father was very authoritarian. He was very controlling. He had a lot of anger. But also he had this sense about him that everything he said was correct and righteous. And so that was the model that I had to base my idea of God on. I was told, your father represents God to you. And so I was afraid of both my father and God. I think I was afraid to just exist, because what if I wasn't a chosen one? Or what if I did something wrong and I didn't understand that I did something wrong? And over time, I understand now that I'm older, I understand I had obsessive compulsive disorder, which is pretty common these kinds of environments where you develop a religious OCD. And I was obsessed about being right with God. And I never felt like I was completely right with God. I felt like something was wrong with me. And I was taught that. I was taught I was depraved. My dad would call us dirty, rotten sinners. That was the term that he used. And because of that, I had no self-confidence and believed I deserved eternal punishment. And so, yeah, it was difficult to grow up that way and be confident and be not afraid of everything. And I think the OCD was a form of anxiety about that, this existential anxiety of trying to figure out why maybe I wasn't a chosen one. Why was I not getting it? That when people said they had so much comfort in this religion, why was I afraid all the time?
More particularly, what were Cait's thoughts and experiences like in an ultra-patriarchal church and culture? What does it do to young girls and their aspirations of womanhood? What does it teach women about sexuality and their bodies and the desires of men around them?
Yeah, one of my earliest memories is a thing I talk about in the beginning of my book. This moment when I'm around 5 years old, and I put on this bathing suit that I had worn the previous year, and it's a 2-piece bathing suit. But I'm 5 years old, right? I'm not a sexual person. Like I'm a little kid, basically a baby. And I remember my father telling my mother to tell me to take off the bathing suit and put on a more modest one. And I had no concept of what that meant at the time. This was one of my earliest memories. And I just felt a lot of shame around my body and what this said about me. I thought I had done something wrong. And I internalized all that shame without understanding what he was even asking for. And so to me, the reason I remember that is because it symbolizes all of the shame and teachings I had around women and women's bodies from such an early age that I've carried with me for decades. As I got older, my older siblings were going to this classical school, and when I turned 5, I went to a school, a private Christian school for a little bit. But then after a couple months, my father pulled me out and decided to start homeschooling me. So this was right around 1993. And homeschooling was becoming more popular, was becoming legal. And it was spreading as this idea of education for religious parents who wanted to really commit to raising their kids in a religious way without outside influence. And so I was the first in my family to be homeschooled. And that really set me on a trajectory of isolation, of indoctrination, that I had no idea was going to happen to me. So growing up that way, I didn't have a lot of outside influence. I was taught what my father believed about God and about gender and what my role was. And over time, it became more and more radicalized. I can see how it became more and more extreme over time, especially as we moved to that OPC church and we became more influenced by Vision Forum, which was an organization similar to Bill Gothard's IBLP and the same kind of teachings, at least. And, this idea of women aren't going to work outside the home, daughters who grow up aren't going to leave home until they get married, that became more of an ingrained principle in our house. And so I never had this idea that I would have any dreams or any jobs outside of being a wife and a mother and serving the patriarch in my life, which at the time was my father and would someday be my husband. And so that was the whole framework of how I existed. And I lost my sense of self in that whole process.
Now, with that background, on to the OPC. After her initial foray in the PCA early on in her life, what was life like in the OPC she attended?
Sure. So my family moved to Colorado in 1998. I was around 10 years old. And we went to a Reformed Presbyterian church for a little while. But it was a denomination that allowed women to be deacons. And
the RPCNA. Yep.
That's right. Yeah. And so my father wouldn't join a church like that because women had some kind of leadership. And so when Kevin Swanson started his church within the OPC, a little bit after that, I believe, we started going, and I talk about this in the book, there was a lot of things going on behind this, in our family. But when we joined, it was this sense of this is the right church. This is the church that's going to teach patriarchy. That was the term that we used. And it's going to teach proper gender roles and how to raise your kids correctly. And we were driving, when it first began, it was in Parker, Colorado, and we were living in Divide. So it was almost a 2-hour drive just to get to church. And we would do that every Sunday. And eventually they moved to Castle Rock, which they're not there anymore, but in Castle Rock was slightly closer. But the reason they moved was so that more people, it was more central to all of the different people traveling from all over the state to come to this church, because it was like the homeschooling church, the patriarchy church. Kevin Swanson was very direct in his vision for this church. For me as a kid, coming into my teen years, it fed that fear that I was already experiencing. And I remember I talked about this in the book too, of his sermon about 9/11, right after that happened, and how he talked about 9/11 and other disasters. He would preach all the time about how they were punishments from God and for the sins of America. And so it fed that idea of God as a God of wrath. And just really, I was afraid all the time. But also being in that church as a girl, there was a lot of pressure to be a certain kind of girl. There were a lot of girls in our church, and there was a running joke that we didn't have enough boys to marry us off. Mm-hmm. And so it felt sometimes like other churches would send young men to visit our church to see if they had any prospects of girls to get married to. And this was when I was a teenager. And it felt so weird because I used to say it felt like we were in a catalog, that we would be examined to see who was, a godly young woman to get married to. but that was a normal thing in our church. It was very normalized to get married very young, through a courtship process. And my father was he was considered the courtship expert in the church because my sister was I believe she was the first person in that church to get married. As a kid, growing up and becoming a young adult and getting married in that church. I think she was the first one through the courtship process. And so my father became this expert, and I was supposed to follow that model. And it's a lot of pressure to feel like you have to live up to that perfection of this Proverbs 31 woman who can do all these household things. And there's no room for you to be an individual or to be different in any way. I felt very lonely and like I couldn't relate to a lot of the other girls. And there was also I also felt like there was this competition of who was going to get married first and who was going to get certain young men to be interested in them without being overly, seductive or something that would be sinful. It was a lot of weird pressure of like, you have to get married, but you can't be the one to start it. So, but all of these thoughts were going through my head as when I was a child. It was not like I was in my 20s and 30s thinking about these things. I was a homeschooled, sheltered young girl who wasn't even sure she wanted to have kids and get married.
Core to the identity of this church, and so often in the waters and Reformed churches in general, is the headship over daughters by their fathers. There's a good and right desire to protect and provide, but it's the control that's at issue here. The boys tend to have more choice as it relates to dating, but the girls are the prize. You find this concentrated in the stay-at-home daughter movement. Here's Cait describing it.
Yeah, so a stay-at-home daughter was this concept that was popularized in Vision Forum, especially with this book called So Much More by the Botkin sisters. They were teenagers, I believe, when they wrote this book. They were not married. So it was this idea that because a girl's goal is to get married and have as many children as possible, it would be a waste of time for her to go to college or pursue a career. And even if she was going to pursue a career, it was dangerous because it would teach her how to be independent and think for herself. And so all of those things became banned for a lot of these families I knew in this movement, the patriarchy movement, because girls leaving home meant that they would have too much independence. And so we were told we had to stay home until we got married. And my father told me I wouldn't be an adult until I got married. So I did not understand that is coercion, especially when you're a legal adult. You are supposed to have choices. I didn't understand what was really happening. And I just believed that I needed to obey my father, and that would be obeying God. And even if I disagreed with some of the things my father did, I would be blessed by honoring that. And so I stayed for a very long time. I stayed until I was 25. I went through, I say 1.5 courtships because I went through a whole courtship.
Yeah.
And
I'll get into your courtships in a second. Yep.
Yeah. And so I had that experience. It was really pivotal for me and in figuring out what I wanted to do with my life and how I was going to leave and choose something different for myself.
We'll get into this in a few weeks, episode 14, Second in Rank. But my guess is, if you're a woman listening to this, you've been told men are logical, women feel. Or men are scared of emotions, women are controlled by them. If you dig down deep enough and you scratch a patriarch, he bleeds fear and control. You see, women are too easily deceived, they say. They're controlled by their emotions, and only a man can lead them on a path of righteousness. In other words, women are told, don't trust your feelings. Cait West goes into this.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to when I was younger and I was, starting to have my first crushes on, the two boys at church that I had interactions with.
Yep.
And I would write my feelings in my journal. But then I would go back with whiteout and I would erase it all because I was ashamed of my feelings because I was taught that they were evil, right? Our feelings are our heart's deceitful. Our feelings don't matter. And so I internalized a lot of shame. I'm very much a shame internalizer. And so by the time I got to be 20 years old and in this first courtship, I was very well practiced at that kind of internalizing of shame. And so I tried really hard to follow the rules, but I found that being with somebody that often, and I was very much attracted to him and I really enjoyed being with him. And I was imagining like, maybe I'm going to get married to him. And what would that be like? I don't think it wasn't possible for me to not have any feelings for him. Even at a base level of just like really caring about him as a person. And so just to have that naturally happen and then to be told you're actively sinning, it was very much that idea of cognitive dissonance where it was like, it's not making sense that I'm being sinful by having a feeling that I can't really control. I had been so good at trying to repress my emotions. I was taught that was a control thing, that was a good thing. But I was finding that your emotions can't be controlled and they are guides to what you should be doing with your life. I didn't know that at the time. But it was just really a moment for me to understand that maybe my emotions weren't wrong and it was okay to love somebody. But I remember my father ended the courtship for different reasons. It wasn't because he was gay, because we didn't really know that. And even if it was, my dad would have said that's not a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And anyways, so my dad ended the courtship after like 8 months. And I was very upset because I had no choice. I had no ability to make a different decision. I just had to submit and go on with my life and somehow forget that I had this connection with somebody. And I was heartbroken. And my father told me, you need to submit to me and repent of your feelings. And you are being sinful and you're cheating on your future spouse with your emotions. And I knew that was wrong. Like there was this deep sense of intuition I had at that moment that this is not correct. I can't be in the wrong for loving somebody. And I started to listen to that voice more and more after that moment. And it took me a few years to leave, but I really believe it was a time for me to understand that what I was being told didn't always mean that was the truth.
This distrust of feelings, the headship over the girl by her father, tends to lead to a practice of courtship. Feelings are fickle and lead you into bad things. You've got to control them and trust your superiors because they know what's best for you. But at the same time, as you'll hear, the moment a woman marries a man, she's expected to turn from prude to sex goddess at the drop of a hat. Your husband has needs and you must fulfill them. But when you're told all your life before you're married, don't trust your feelings, they're deceitful, don't be attractive or seductive, don't wake up love before it's ready, that change can not only be difficult, it seems impossible. From nothing to everything. Here's how Cait navigated her courtship.
There were different methods of courtship in this movement, and it depended on the father and the father's preferences. So my father followed a certain guidebook, and he promoted that to our church and to anybody he knew. It was called The Pathway to Christian Marriage. It's written by a man named John Thompson. If I'm not mistaken, I think he was also in the OPC, but I would have to check on that.
Mm-hmm.
And this booklet is still available online. You can download it. It teaches you how to have a courtship process that follows a literal interpretation of Bible stories, particularly the Old Testament Bible stories. So, like, for instance, it takes the story of how Abraham found a wife for Isaac, and it takes lessons from that to create this process that might work in the modern world. And certain things about it was you can't ever be alone with someone you're in a courtship with. So you always have to be chaperoned. You can't talk about anything that might instigate emotional attraction or, heaven forbid, physical attraction. So you have to go through questions with your father to determine if you're eligible to get married to each other. And the pathway to Christian marriage has a list of questions you're supposed to go through. And once you do that, if your father approves of the match, he can say you can get married or you can get betrothed. And then at that point, the young man can ask the young woman to marry him. And it was always framed as, at that point, the woman can say no, right? She has that option to say no. That was presented as, this is why it's consent and not an arranged marriage. Mm. But once you go through that process, and if this is a person your father wants you to get married to, there are very limited options for you. And saying no was almost unimaginable at that point. So I would argue it's not really much of a choice for the women in these situations. So once you say yes and you become betrothed, you sign a covenant document to say that you are committed to marrying this person. And so it was taught that this was on the same level as marriage, it just wasn't a legal marriage yet. And if you wanted to break up, that would be equivalent to a divorce. So betrothal was very serious commitment. And that was the point when you were allowed to have emotional attraction to the other person. So you're allowed to let that grow, which I guess is a switch you can turn on. But you're still not allowed to have any physical contact with the other person until your wedding day. So no kissing or anything like that until your wedding day. When your father turns his daughter as his property over to her husband as his property. They wouldn't use that term property. I use that specifically because that's really what's happening. They would say that he was turning his headship over. And so it was a method of getting married that was very much not like dating. Dating was taught as a practice for divorce, and courtship was taught as the true biblical way to find a godly marriage and honor God with your life.
But Cait got out. And it started with questions. It started with a few people who started asking her questions. Here's what Cait started asking.
Yeah, I definitely think this was the beginning of me having a mental shift, because I think when you leave a situation like this, it has to be, there's a mental barrier before there's the practical barriers to leaving. And at that time, I was journaling a lot. I was having conversations with myself in my journal about, I feel this way. I feel awful, and I can't eat. I can't sleep. But I just need to submit better. I just need to follow the rules better, and then it will be okay. And I was using the words of my father to try to soothe that anxiety, but also realizing it wasn't working. And I was very much a prayerful person. I was asking God to help me understand what was going wrong and why I was so unhappy, because I was in my early 20s at that point. I was very depressed. I didn't have really any friends. I lived on this isolated island in Hawaii, and my dad would send me off to do jobs he approved of. So I was allowed to go to other church families and homeschool their kids or babysit them. Anything that had children involved, I was allowed to do that, but I wasn't allowed to pursue my own interests. And it just started to feel really sick all the time. And I think that was my body starting to break down and realize like I've been holding a lot for a couple decades now, and it wasn't healthy for me. But I in my book I talk about it took me until I was 25 to leave, so that's about 4 years. And in that time, there's a lot of those mental shifts of trying to figure out what I really believed and what I really wanted, and actually allowing myself to want something and not to feel guilty about that. And there were a couple people who asked me my opinion about what I wanted to do with my life. Because even in that church, there were some people who were confused about the whole courtship and the stay-at-home daughter thing because they hadn't grown up that way. And so they would ask me, like, is this what you want to do? And I always had a script of things I would say, you know, what I had been taught to say. Of course, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is what God wants me to do. I'm just going to do this, this, and this, and then I'll get married, and that will be my life's purpose. But them asking my opinion really made a big difference, probably more than they realized, because it caused me to ask myself questions and to actually wonder, oh, like, do I have a choice in this? Is there a way that I could have a choice in my life? And so I always say that to people who are concerned about family members who are stuck in these kinds of situations. Like, always ask questions and promote the other person's sense of agency, because they might not even realize it's there. And so when people asked me or were interested in what I wanted in my life, all of those things added up for me, even though they were small interactions, because I was still very isolated. And it made a big difference because I realized there were other people who didn't live like this. I mean, I always knew that, but, you know, interacting with them and realizing, oh, maybe I could be one of those different people and I don't need to do this. And maybe that's not actually going against God. That would just be maybe better. Maybe God would want that for me. All of that was happening in my mind. Again, I'm very much an internalizing person. So I was doing a lot of writing and just thinking and stewing on this. And this happened over years. And then I started teaching piano lessons, which my father got me into, actually. Mm-hmm. But I was allowed to keep the money from that. And so this doesn't always happen in this movement. A lot of girls I know, they are very limited in resources. Like they might not have a birth certificate or a social security card. If they have a job like teaching piano, then their parents have access to their bank account. So I was lucky in the sense that I had my own bank account and I was able to keep the money from teaching piano. And ultimately, that's what helped me leave, was having a little bit of money to buy a plane ticket and leave my family. And the book talks about that whole process, because that's the second courtship that happened in this relationship I had that my father didn't approve of. And it was a big catalyst for me leaving.
Always ask questions and promote the other person's sense of agency. Wonderful advice, and yet so difficult in these situations. It wasn't smooth sailing for Cait. Asking questions in these high-control churches isn't looked well upon. Cait discusses what happened after she started questioning.
Yeah, it was one of the most difficult times in my life, to be honest. It was dangerous. I knew it was dangerous to question things. I learned that very early on. Witnessing things that had happened to my older siblings. Like, my older brother had left home when he was 17 and joined the army, and we lost contact with him for a while. So I understood that I could lose my family if I was not going to conform. But once I started thinking these things, I felt like I had to, out of integrity, tell my father what I was thinking. And I don't know if I would always advise abuse survivors to take the same tactics that I did. I didn't understand it was abuse in these early days of questioning. So I honestly thought if I could explain to my father what was happening, maybe he would change his mind and let me have more choices and decisions. It was very naive of me. And I learned the hard way that that was very much not the case. I remember things like looking up on the internet. I finally got a computer and I was allowed to look, I had the internet. I was very good at self-policing, but at this time I started breaking the rules and looking up stuff when my dad wasn't around. And so I did find out this term, emotional abuse and spiritual abuse. And I had this language that really shifted how I was perceiving what was happening to me. I realized this is happening to me all the time. And that's why it's not okay. That's why I feel so sick all the time. And I confronted my dad about that. And it would always end up in arguments or him yelling at me and calling me names. This one scene in the book is when he calls me a rebellious feminist, which is his worst insult.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't sound that bad, but for him, it was like the worst thing you could be is a feminist. And it was very stressful. Like people talk about that term, walking on eggshells. That's kind of what it felt like. But it also just felt like this boiling, like a volcano just going to erupt at any moment if he found out I did something wrong or I disobeyed him again or I wasn't doing the dishes enough or something like that. He was very volatile. I ended up asking the pastor of my church. So this was a different church. It was not an OPC church, but it was in the Reformed tradition in Hawaii. And I asked my pastor via email if I could come talk to him. And I had to secretly go over to his house. I had to walk over to his house. Thankfully, he didn't live very far. And had a secret meeting with him where I shared a few details. And this is very common with abuse survivors is you don't tell everything because you're not sure you can trust the person. And so I shared a few things and I was crying and I was very upset. And I was like, this is one of the first times I'm ever telling anybody what has been going on in my home. And he says he's gonna figure out something and talk to my dad at some point and try to help me sort this out because, I'm talking to the pastor. My dad's the only elder in this church. There's a lot of power dynamics at play here that I didn't understand. And I said, please just don't call him right away because he doesn't know I'm here. And I'm really afraid. And that's my memory of it. I don't know if I just didn't communicate that well. I want to give some compassion and grace here. But also I don't want to give anyone a pass either for certain behaviors. So what happened was I ran home through the woods because I was afraid my father would see me. He was still on his errand at the time. I got home. I went to my room and just sat there because this was a terrible thing I had done. I had betrayed my parents. And my father came home and almost immediately the phone rang. And I knew right away it was the pastor calling and talking to my dad. And I think he had good intentions. I think he wanted to help. But my father hung up the phone and I've never seen him so angry before. And I've seen my father angry a lot. But this moment, it was I was really scared. The way he was talking, yelling at me. And all because I had talked to somebody outside of the home about what was happening. And it wasn't that I was lying. It was that I had told somebody and I wasn't lying. And he knew that. And so I learned really fast to be really wary of who to trust, who to talk to. And also that I was in a really scary situation where I didn't know how to navigate all of these types of things or who to ask for help. That was the first night I had my first panic attack. It was really scary to have your first panic attack and not know what a panic attack is. Mm-hmm. It felt like I was dying and I just didn't know what to do. And, at some points I was struggling with suicidal ideation, not knowing, just wanting to escape and just be free. It was a very stressful time. And, now looking back, it's over a decade ago that this happened. And I can look back and feel a lot of compassion for that young woman who like didn't know any better. But I was also really angry at myself at the time because I just didn't want to be hurt anymore. I didn't want to be subjected to this treatment anymore. But I didn't know what to do for myself. So, I mean, that's the hardest part of the story is when I talked for myself, I spoke out about what was happening, the abuse got worse. And that happens a lot, in these kinds of situations. And so the only recourse was for me to find a way to leave. And that's when things eventually got better, actually finding a way out. And so that's why I want to keep talking about this, is because sometimes it gets a lot worse before it gets better. And I want to give people hope that it really does get better.
Now that Cait has gotten out and rebuilt her life, what advice would she give to those women stuck in these kinds of churches? We'll end with Cait's parting advice.
Sure. The first group, the people who are attracted to this and are considering joining a church like this, I would say, first off, it's never as nice looking. It's never as shiny as it appears. Something like Vision Forum, like they're very good at marketing. Doug Wilson is very good at marketing his brand of Christianity. But once you live within that system, it's really not a good situation for anyone who doesn't have power. And so because the system depends on patriarchy, it sets up men at the top and women and children at the bottom. It's a situation that is ripe for abuse, and so many different kinds of abuse happen in patriarchal systems. And the problem is, especially for women, once you join and you say, I'm going to submit to this, you're giving up your agency, and there's no taking that back. They're not going to give that back to you. The only way to leave is to get excommunicated or to get cut off. And so it might seem like a good idea now because it promises security and this idea of certainty. But I think just as humans, we have that fear of uncertainty, and we're attracted to things that might bring us that sense of stability. But in my experience, it's a false sense of security, because I never felt secure in that world of certainty. It wasn't until I left and had to embrace the uncertain aspects of life that I could find a sense of security within myself. But being in that world was not safe, and it can escalate very quickly, and abusers are never held accountable to the way they should be. And that's a problem with the system and the theology and the way they treat women. And I think it's not something that is going to change within that system. I think it needs to be dismantled in a certain sense. Whatever that looks like. I'm not trying to be an anarchist or anything like that right now, but I just think it's important to look at the root of the problem and not just say, oh, it's just my pastor or that pastor. There's a bigger system at play here. For the people who are in it and who are struggling and want to leave, I know some stay-at-home daughters right now who are trying to leave, and it's difficult because I wish I could just pull them out and give them a place to be and give them a life, outside of it. And it's not as simple as that. It takes a lot of work to have the confidence to leave and to find a way on your own. I would say it's okay to take time to figure that out. If you're in danger, leave immediately and call the police. If you have a home and it's starting to feel unsafe and you're not sure what to do, it's okay to take some time to figure out what to do and to reach out to people. There are a lot of resources now that didn't exist when I was leaving. Tears of Eden is an organization I volunteer with. There's another one called the Vashti Initiative. And these kinds of supports can help you find solidarity and hope outside of the small world you might be living in. And with social media, it's really helpful to see other ways to live. And I always say, look at other people who have left and all the different ways they exist. And you get to choose what you want to do. You don't have to follow someone else's path out or someone else's choice in life. You get to decide what you want with the one life you have. And that can include faith. It could include not having faith anymore. It's up to you to determine that. And I want to encourage them to hold on to their agency, because that's what being a human is all about, is being yourself and showing up as yourself. And if you're in a world where you aren't allowed to be yourself, it's never going to be safe for you.
I would like to thank both Rachel Curtis and Cait West for their courage and vulnerability in sharing their stories. Before we conclude, I'd like to end with the story of the woman at the well. Maybe you think this is an odd choice for this episode, but here's why. Jesus is not scared of women. Jesus never lusted after a woman. Jesus never shielded his eyes when looking upon a woman. Jesus never told a woman to shut up and sit down. Jesus never asked a woman, "Why are you speaking to me? I can only speak through your Father." Jesus created women. Jesus loves women. Jesus treats women as he treats men. Jesus cared for women. In a day and age when women were little better than slaves, he saw them as equals. Here's John 4:25-30. The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, am he." Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" Then, leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" They came out of the town and made their way toward him. Jesus didn't shy away from calling out her sin. She had 5 previous men that she had slept with, and the one she's sleeping with then was not her husband. What he did do was treat her as he would treat a man. He treated her with dignity. No rabbi would be caught dead speaking to a woman at this time, let alone one who was known for sleeping around. But Jesus is different. He sees the one he created. He doesn't see a temptress, a seductress, a human easy to deceive, a person who shouldn't vote, or someone who needs to be under authority lest they fall. He sees someone made in his own image. He sees a woman in all her glory and beauty. He sees a woman made for and deserving of love. Someone who has autonomy and the ability to make her own choices. He sees the complement of man, just as man is the complement of the woman. He sees you, his beloved. As we end, if you have a story like Rachel Curtis's or Cait West's, the OPC, Reformed Church in general, or the CREC, please know you're not alone. Know we care about you, and many others do as well. Reach out to us. Find out how to do so in our show notes, but do so safely, especially if you're still in an environment like the movements we're profiling. There really is help out there for you, and we'll help you find it. Next week, we end our series of abuse in the OPC with another CREC story added in, and we move on to our next denomination. See you then. Sons of Patriarchy is brought to you by the administrators of Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow in partnership with Peter Bell. It's written, produced, and edited by Peter Bell. Original music, sound design, and mixing by Aaron Feeney. This series wouldn't be possible without the dozens of abuse survivors whose bravery and vulnerability make it what it is. Every episode was sent to them before being published, and their feedback, edits, encouragement, and eventual approval make this what it is. May your voices be heard far and wide. Thank you.